I don't need to be a professional counselor to know that you don't enjoy conflict. None of us do. But the reality is that conflict is a part of the human experience. And if you haven't yet experienced it in your ministry, then welcome, because you're probably brand new to the job. It is a part of every family relationship. It's a part of every person's individual life. It's a part of the workplace. And conflict is also a part of the church and every other Christian ministry. But what we're talking about today is not so much why does conflict happen or how can we avoid it at all costs. What we're going to talk about today are a few tips from my years as a counselor and just my own experiences of dealing with conflict. 4 tips that will help you manage conflict within your ministry or your church or maybe even your own personal life. You are listening to Counseling Tips for Pastors and Ministry Leaders, and my name is Jessica Hayes. I'm a licensed counselor and a licensed marriage and family therapist in the state of South Carolina. And I'm also the director at a small nonprofit in the PD area called iHope Christian Care and Counseling. And iHope is sponsoring this podcast with the goal of equipping pastors and ministry leaders when it comes to the counseling related or relationship issues that are inevitable in ministry, and to encourage you in the hard work that you are doing. And I am excited for this conversation, not because I love conflict, but because I know how many of us will go to extreme lengths to try to avoid conflict, to brush it under the rug, to smile and pretend it's not happening, to try to please everyone around us instead of dealing with the real issue. And none of that is actually helpful or healthy for your ministry or for yourself. So I am glad for this opportunity to share a few tips and ideas with you about how to protect your ministry, protect yourself, so that conflict does not throw everything totally off course. And if you are curious to learn more about iHope Christian Care and Counseling, the services that we offer here in South Carolina, or to make a donation and support, we're a nonprofit, a 501c3, and we welcome your donations for exactly this type of ministry, a podcast, as well as the counseling work that we do. All of that is over at ihopeflorence.com. And I'll remind you of that again at the end of today's episode. And if you're driving or something like that, no, don't pull out your phone and go to the website. You can do it later. But I do hope that some of these tips and ideas are helpful for you. So let's jump in. And like I said, we're going to jump right over the topic of why do we struggle with conflict? Or what does that really look like in our ministry? Because most of us already have a decent understanding of what conflict is, some of the reasons why we struggle with it, and we're getting stuck at the point of how do I handle it? How do I respond in a helpful way that doesn't just throw my boundaries out the window or, like I said before, brush everything under the rug? How do we actually manage conflict well? And the first thing that I would encourage you to do is to be aware in your ministry, in your life, and try to recognize warning signs that conflict might be brewing. And honestly, we might think of this as a really like a no-brainer type of tip because it can think like, okay, of course I know conflict can happen, and if I saw it coming, it wouldn't be that big of a deal. But the reality is, people tend to go through life in our own little bubble. We tend to think that other people think like us, feel like us, react to things like us. And especially in a leadership role where you probably have tasks or goals in many of your conversations with people or meetings that you're having. And it can be easy to be like, I'm just going down my lane, and conflict can feel like it's coming out of the blue. When in reality, there are usually warning signs. So if you notice something like you're having a conversation and someone's tone of voice is starting to change, or just the atmosphere in the room is feeling a bit more tense, if you notice emotions getting big, that does not mean that there is conflict, but those might be warning signs that conflict is coming. Anytime emotions are getting high, tension is building, that's an early sign of potential conflict. But we also might notice warning signs like we start avoiding certain people or certain situations. And maybe we don't really know why, we're not really thinking about it, but I'm just not going to call that person today. I think I might skip that meeting this week. They don't really need me anyway. And we might realize, if we are honest about it, that there's some tension in the relationship. There might be some conflict that in a healthy way actually does need to get addressed. And probably a more obvious warning sign of conflict coming is that there's an outright disagreement, or the tone of voice in a conversation is escalating to a big degree. And yes, that can happen in a professional workplace. It can happen at church. These are all warning signs that conflict is coming. And it's not that common in churches or in a ministry context to necessarily see conflict escalate to the point of a physical interaction or altercation. Of course, that can happen. It's a lot more likely that conflict is going to create division. It's going to create tension. It might lead to opportunity for gossip or people choosing sides. And really the best case scenario is people just don't feel unified and cared for. And if that's the best case scenario, that's not so good. So when you notice these warning signs, that second step is to start with yourself. Manage your own words in the interaction, manage your own emotions in the interaction. And we had an episode just a few weeks back with some tips around interpersonal communication. So you might want to head back and listen to that if that area of how do I communicate if my emotions are getting high in a way that is still healthy and appropriate. But a lot of times when conflict is brewing, we start to think about how could I control the situation? How can I stop their emotions from escalating? And the reality is we can never control the other person. The only one we have control over is ourselves. And if you're honest about, I am feeling frustrated, I am feeling angry, I am feeling hurt or taken advantage of, now you can deal with that actual emotion. And it's really helpful here to get a break, to take a little bit of space. Obviously some situations that's not possible, but it's pretty rare that you couldn't at least take a break to pause, bite your tongue, maybe close your eyes, take a deep breath, and at least pause and slow down the conversation. If you notice you are getting escalated, that is your part of managing and resolving the conflict. Do what you need to do so that your emotions are not escalating. And then as you're managing yourself with your emotions, we also need to manage our communication. Because it might be really tempting now to lean into some passive aggressive sarcasm or dropping hints or maybe being very directive, overly directive with people, or very passive with people. But to try to pause and just be clear about, this is what I'm thinking, or this is why I'm advocating for something in particular. You might even want to observe that, it seems like things are getting kind of tense. I wonder if we should take a little pause and then come back. But be intentional about your words at that point. so that you can continue to follow the biblical commands of kindness, compassion, honesty. We need to approach our conversations, especially if emotions are high, with a perspective that, would I say this same thing if other people were in the room? Would I say it if my mother was standing next to me? Would I say it if your mother was standing next to you? Would I say it if Jesus was sitting across the table? That can really change how we communicate during conflict. But a third tip here, which I already referenced, would be don't be afraid to say pause on the conversation or the situation and take a break to cool down. And this is not the time to mentally rehearse all the things you could have, should have said, or to dwell on how you're right and they're wrong. This is the time to calm down and pray and maybe think about, what did I say that maybe was unclear? How could I apologize or come at this from a different angle, or try better or more constructively to hear their point of view? But don't be afraid to say, I need a little bit of time to process this or to calm down so that this can be helpful. And a little asterisk there might be, don't tell them they need to calm down. It's never helpful to say, you look upset. I think you need a break to cool down. That's only going to escalate the conflict. You take ownership. You call for a little timeout. I need some space. I would like to pray about this, get some more perspective, and come back together. And then we always need to follow up at that point with trying to find resolution. That might be the same conversation. It might be in a future conversation. But resolving conflict, you want to notice it. You want to manage your own reactions. You want to be prepared and willing to take a step back. But you can't stay there. We have to step back in for the sake of the relationship and possibly for the sake of actually solving the problem at hand or coming up with the action plan, depending, of course, on what the conflict is about. But try to find resolution. And often the best way to do that when there is conflict and there's not just maybe different perspectives, but there's heated emotion with it, is to bring in someone else, a third party, maybe a mediator, maybe just an extra person who kind of knows a little bit of what's going on. Get some extra perspective into the conversation, and ultimately trying to brainstorm, to put all of your ideas out there and their ideas out there with no judgment. It's okay to think in your head, oh, that idea won't work because of reasons X, Y, and Z, but just put it out there. Put it on the paper or put it into the conversation. Wait until you have several ideas from every party before you come back to then try to evaluate, well, which ideas might be the most realistic or the most helpful. And sometimes conflict is just a matter of, let's apologize and move on and do something different if there's not actually a problem to solve. So I don't expect that these tips are going to make you excited for the next round of conflict in your ministry, but I do hope that they will give some perspective, that the sooner you notice this is the direction we're heading in, you can take ownership for yourself and manage those emotions, be intentional about what you're saying and how you're saying it, take a little time, make sure you're praying, make sure you're getting a balanced perspective. And if it is appropriate to the interaction or the situation, don't just leave it hanging. Come back, take ownership that, hey, we need to solve this problem. We need to resolve this. Maybe that's an apology. Maybe that's bringing in an extra person for support or help. Maybe that's brainstorming ideas and picking one to move forward with. This can hopefully keep the wheels moving, not only for getting things done in your ministry, but for the far more important task of building and sustaining a healthy relationship with the other person. We all know Jesus did not die so that your checklist could get accomplished. He died for the people you are serving, and he died for you. and he's not surprised by conflict. He's not overwhelmed by conflict. And he does offer peace and restoration and healing and forgiveness in the face of conflict. So if you have found this conversation helpful, I would love for you to subscribe to the channel here for counseling tips for pastors and ministry leaders. I would love for you to copy the link and share it with a friend or a colleague. And I would love for you to leave a quick review on Apple Podcast or Spotify, or leave a comment if you're watching on YouTube, because that really does encourage us. You can tell us what topics you want us to cover, and it helps us, as far as algorithms and all of those fancy tech things go, to grow the reach and be able to support more and more pastors, more and more Christian leaders. And I'm thankful you're here. And don't forget, you can find out more about iHope, our services, our counseling services, in person and virtual. You can make a donation to support this ministry if you're in South Carolina. All of that is at ihopeflorence.com. And we will be back next week with more tips and encouragement for you and your ministry. So until then, have a wonderful week.